Some bonds run deeper than memory, deeper than time itself. For 58-year-old Ray Ellison, losing his beloved donkey Rosie in a wildfire 21 years ago carved a hole in his heart that never quite healed. He'd saved her from drowning as a young cowboy, and for a decade they'd been partners across the desert ranges of New Mexico. When the flames took her, Ray searched until his boots wore through and his hope ran dry. He moved on because he had to, not because he wanted to. Now, walking into a small rescue sanctuary just to drop off some feed, Ray freezes at the sight of an old grey donkey with a scar he'd know anywhere. Could it really be her, after all this time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Ray Ellison first laid eyes on Rosie, he'd been 27 years old and certain he understood the way the world worked. He'd grown up on his father's cattle ranch in the high desert country of New Mexico, where the land stretched out in endless waves of sage and juniper, and the sky pressed down so close you could taste the weather coming 3 days before it arrived. His hands were already calloused from years of mending fence, his back already bent from lifting hay bales, and his heart already hardened by the particular loneliness that comes from choosing a life where your closest neighbors lived 15 miles away and your best conversations happened with horses. That June morning had started ordinary enough. Ray had been riding the fence line along the southern pasture when storm clouds gathered over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains with the kind of speed that made a man nervous. The air turned green and heavy, pressing against his chest like a warning. He'd turned his horse Cisco back toward the ranch house, moving at a steady trot, when the sky opened up with a fury he'd rarely seen. Rain came down in sheets so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead, and the arroyos that had been bone-dry minutes before suddenly roared to life with flash floods that could sweep a cow off its feet. He heard the braying before he saw anything. It cut through the thunder and the hammering rain, a desperate sound that spoke of terror and exhaustion. Ray pulled Cisco to a halt and listened, trying to locate the source. There it was again, weaker this time, coming from the direction of Cottonwood Creek. He urged his horse forward carefully, knowing the ground would be treacherous, knowing his wife Martha would have words for him if he got himself killed trying to save some animal that probably wasn't worth saving. But that wasn't how Ray was built. His father had taught him that a man's character showed clearest in what he did when nobody was watching, when there was no profit in kindness, when the easiest thing would be to turn away. So he rode toward that desperate braying, and when he reached the swollen creek bank, he found her. The donkey was wedged between two cottonwood roots, half submerged in the muddy water, her eyes rolling white with panic. She was small, probably not more than 3 years old, and skinny in a way that told Ray she'd been neglected long before the flood found her. Her grey coat was matted with mud and debris, and there was a gash behind her left ear where she'd struck something in the current. Blood mixed with the rain running down her neck. Ray dismounted and secured Cisco to a sturdy branch, then worked his way down the slippery bank. The water was waist-deep and moving fast, pulling at his legs with insistent fingers. He talked to the donkey in a low, steady voice, the same tone he used with spooked horses, telling her it would be all right, telling her to hold on just a little longer, telling her he wasn't going to let the water take her. It took him 20 minutes to free her from the roots. She fought him at first, panic making her dangerous, her hooves striking out at anything that came close. Ray took a kick to his ribs that knocked the wind out of him and nearly sent him under, but he held on. When he finally got her loose, he half-carried, half-dragged her up the bank, his boots slipping in the mud, his muscles screaming with the effort. By the time they reached level ground, both of them were gasping for air, and the rain had finally started to ease. He got her back to the ranch, just as the storm broke apart into ragged clouds and pale sunlight. Martha came out of the house with a towel over her head, took one look at the bedraggled donkey, and shook her head with the particular expression she reserved for her husband's rescue projects. Over the years, he'd brought home orphaned calves, injured coyotes, a hawk with a broken wing, and once a half-starved Mustang that nobody else could get within 50 feet of. Martha had learned to make peace with sharing her home with creatures that needed more help than sense. "Another one," she said, but there was warmth underneath the exasperation. "Well, bring her into the barn. I'll get the first aid kit." Ray led the donkey into the shelter of the barn, and she followed docilely now, too exhausted to resist. He tied her loosely in one of the empty stalls and began examining her injuries. The gash behind her ear would need cleaning and probably stitches. She had scrapes along her flanks and a deep cut on her right foreleg. But it was her eyes that concerned him most. They had a glazed, distant quality that spoke of shock and malnutrition and a life that hadn't been kind. Martha returned with supplies, and together they worked on the donkey through the afternoon. Ray cleaned and stitched the ear wound, while Martha wrapped the leg. They offered water, which the donkey drank greedily, and hay, which she barely touched. When they were done, Ray pulled up an overturned bucket and sat in the stall, just watching her, studying the way she held. Herself, the tension in her shoulders, the wariness that never quite left her eyes. "You think she'll make it?" Martha asked from the stall door. Ray considered the question. The donkey was in bad shape, no denying that. She'd been neglected, half-drowned, and traumatized. The smart money said she wouldn't last the week. But there was something in the way she looked at him, a spark buried deep beneath the fear, that made him believe otherwise. "She's a fighter," he said finally. "She just doesn't know it yet." Martha smiled at that. "What are you going to call her?" Ray hadn't thought about a name. He studied the donkey's face, the way her ears swiveled toward any sound, the intelligence behind the exhaustion. "Rosie," he said. "We'll call her Rosie." Over the next weeks, Ray devoted himself to bringing Rosie back to health. He spent hours in the barn, sitting quietly while she ate, talking to her in that same low, steady voice he'd used in the flood. He changed her bandages twice a day, applied ointment to her wounds, and made sure she had the best hay and grain the ranch could provide. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to transform. The weight came back first, filling out her ribs and giving her coat a healthier sheen. The wounds healed, leaving scars but no permanent damage. But the real change was in her eyes. The wariness faded, replaced by curiosity, and then something that looked remarkably like trust. She started nickering when Ray approached, pushing her muzzle into his hands, following him around the barn like a large grey shadow. By the end of summer, Rosie had become part of the ranch's daily rhythm. She grazed with the horses in the morning pasture, brayed at dinner time with perfect punctuality, and took it upon herself to supervise any work happening in the barn. She had a personality that was part stubborn, part sweet, and entirely her own. When Ray rode out to check cattle, Rosie followed, trotting along behind Cisco with her ears forward, and her tail swishing contentment. Martha, who had been skeptical at first, found herself charmed despite her better judgment. "That donkey thinks she's people," she observed one evening, watching Rosie stand at the fence line, gazing toward the house with an expression of profound patience. "She's waiting for you to invite her in for supper." Ray laughed, but there was truth in Martha's words. Rosie had attached herself to him with a completeness that went beyond normal animal behavior. She wasn't just tame, she was devoted. When Ray was sick with the flu that October, Rosie stood at the pasture fence closest to the house for 3 days straight, refusing to graze, barely drinking, just watching and waiting until he emerged. When he finally appeared on the porch, still shaky but recovered, her braying of relief could be heard across the entire valley. The years that followed established a partnership that became legendary among the local ranchers. Ray and Rosie worked together with a synchronicity that seemed almost uncanny. She learned to help drive cattle, positioning herself exactly where she was needed without being told. She could detect predators before the horses sensed anything wrong, her braying serving as an early warning system that saved more than one calf from coyotes. She carried supplies on pack trips into the mountains, sure-footed on trails that made the horses nervous. But more than her usefulness, It was the companionship that mattered most to Ray. In the long hours of solitary work that defined ranch life, Rosie was constant presence. She never judged, never complained, never asked for more than he could give. She simply was there, solid and real, and devoted in a way that touched something deep in Ray's heart that he hadn't even known needed touching. On summer evenings, after the work was done, Ray would sometimes sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea while Rosie grazed nearby. Martha would join him, and they'd watch the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. In those moments, with his wife beside him and his faithful donkey nearby, Ray felt a contentment so complete it was almost painful. This was what life was supposed to be. This was what mattered. Not wealth or fame or anything else the world said was important, but this connection, purpose, presence. She's special, that one. Martha said one of those evenings, nodding toward Rosie. Ray nodded. Behind Rosie's left ear, barely visible beneath her grey coat, the crescent-shaped scar from that first day remained as a reminder of where they'd started, of how close they'd both come to losing something precious before they'd even known it was there to lose. Yeah, Ray agreed softly. She's special. Their daughter Emily had been 10 years old when Rosie arrived, and she'd grown up with the donkey as a constant presence in her life. Emily would ride on Rosie's back through the pastures, her small hands gripping the donkey's mane, her laughter ringing across the valley. Rosie tolerated the child's exuberance with patient grace, never once bucking or running, always careful with her precious cargo. As Emily grew older, she'd spend afternoons in the barn doing homework, while Rosie stood nearby, as if the donkey understood that her presence was comforting. When Emily left for college in Colorado, one of the hardest goodbyes was to Rosie, who stood at the fence line watching the car drive away, braying softly as if she too understood that things were changing. During Emily's college years, she'd call home and always ask about Rosie. "How's my girl doing?" She'd ask. And Ray would recount the week's small events, how Rosie had chased a coyote away from the chickens, how she'd stolen an apple from Martha's basket, how she'd stood in the rain rather than go into the barn because she was watching for Ray to return from town. Those years were golden ones. Ray's father had passed, away peacefully at 83, leaving Ray the ranch free and clear. Martha's vegetable garden flourished, and she'd started selling preserves at the farmer's market in town. Emily graduated and found work as an architect in Denver. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable, predictable, good. And through it all, Rosie remained the steady heartbeat of the ranch, the creature around whom so much of Ray's daily life revolved. He'd wake each morning, and his first thought would be of feeding her. He'd end each day with a final check of the barn, making sure she was comfortable and safe. In between, he'd catch glimpses of her through windows, hear her distinctive bray, feel her presence even when he couldn't see her. "You love that donkey more than you love me," Martha would tease, though they both knew it wasn't true. But Ray did love Rosie in a way that surprised him with its depth. She'd become part of his identity, part of how he understood himself in the world. He was Ray Ellison, rancher, husband, father, and he was the man who'd saved Rosie from the flood, who'd earned her trust and devotion, who'd been chosen by an animal as her person. He had no way of knowing, sitting there in the golden evening light with everything he loved gathered close, that in just 3 more years a wall of fire would sweep across this valley and tear his world apart. He had no way of knowing that the scar behind Rosie's ear would become the most important mark in his life, the key to a mystery that would take more than 2 decades to solve. He only knew, in that perfect moment, that he was blessed beyond measure, and that some gifts arrive, wearing the disguise of disaster, waiting to be recognized by those willing to see. The fire came on a September afternoon, when the air had been dry for so long that even the rocks seemed to thirst for water. Ray had been aware of the danger. Every rancher in the county had been on high alert for weeks, watching the mountains, monitoring the weather reports, moving livestock closer to water sources. But awareness and preparation could only do so much when nature decided to remind humans exactly how small they were. It started 20 miles to the west, sparked by a lightning strike in the deadwood forests that climbed the slopes of the Sangre de Cristos. By the time Ray heard about it on the radio, the fire had already consumed 5,000 acres and was moving fast, pushed by winds that seemed determined to feed the flames. He stood in the kitchen, listening to the evacuation warnings, watching Martha's face go pale as the announcer listed the areas in the fire's path. Their ranch wasn't mentioned yet, but the way the wind was blowing, it was only a matter of time. "We need to go," Martha said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Pack what we can and get out while the roads are still clear." Ray nodded, already running through the logistics in his mind. They had 40 head of cattle, 6 horses, a barn full of chickens, and Rosie. The cattle would have to be driven down to the lower pasture near the creek, where they'd at least have water and less vegetation to fuel the fire. The horses could be loaded into the trailer. The chickens, well, the chickens would have to take their chances, but Rosie would come with them in the truck bed, tied securely where he could keep an eye on her. They worked with the efficiency of people who'd spent 30 years moving in tandem. Martha threw clothes and photographs and documents into duffel bags while Ray started loading the horse trailer. The sky to the west had turned a sickly orange color, and smoke was beginning to drift across the valley in wispy tendrils that smelled of destruction. The cattle sensed something wrong and moved skittishly when Ray tried to drive them, but eventually they made it to the lower pasture. The horses loaded easier, nervous, but trusting. Then Ray went looking for Rosie. She wasn't in the barn, where he expected. She wasn't in the near pasture or the corral, or anywhere in her usual spots. Ray called for her, his voice getting increasingly desperate as minutes ticked by. Martha came out of the house with the last of their bags, saw his face, and understood immediately. "Where is she?" she asked. "I don't know. She's not answering." Ray cupped his hands around his mouth and called again, the special whistle he'd taught Rosie to respond to, the one that usually brought her running from wherever she'd wandered. Nothing. The smoke was getting thicker now, and the sky had turned from orange to a dark, bruised purple. In the distance, they could hear the fire itself, a sound like wind but deeper, more malevolent, punctuated by the crack and crash of falling trees. The radio in the truck was screaming evacuation orders, saying the fire had jumped the ridge and was now moving at unprecedented speed toward the valley. "Ray, we have to go," Martha said, touching his arm. "We have to go right now. I can't leave her." His voice broke on the words. "I can't just leave her. You don't have a choice. If we don't go now, we won't make it out." Ray looked at his wife, saw the tears on her cheeks, saw the absolute certainty that they were out of time. He looked back toward the mountains, toward the smoke and the approaching flames, and felt something in his chest crack clean through. Rosie was out there somewhere. Maybe she'd gotten spooked and run to the far pasture. Maybe she was hiding in one of the arroyos. Maybe she was already dead, overcome by smoke or trapped by flames. He didn't know. And that not knowing was a torture he would carry for the rest of his life. Martha pulled him toward the truck. He resisted at first, then let himself be led, his body moving while his mind stayed behind, still calling for Rosie, still listening for her, answering Bray. They climbed into the cab and Ray started the engine, the horse trailer rattling behind them. As they pulled out of the driveway, he looked back one more time, hoping against hope to see that familiar grey shape come trotting out of the smoke. The road was clogged with other evacuees, vehicles moving in a slow, steady stream away from the approaching inferno. Ray drove mechanically, his hands on the wheel, his eyes on the road, but his thoughts miles behind with the donkey who'd become his shadow, his partner, his friend. Beside him, Martha was crying silently, and he knew she was mourning not just Rosie, but the life they were leaving behind, the home they'd built, the certainty of ever returning to what was. They made it to the high school in town, which had been converted into an evacuation shelter. They parked the trailer in the makeshift corral that had been set up in the football field and joined the other refugees inside the gymnasium. People were spread out on cots and sleeping bags, families huddled together, the air thick with worry and displaced grief. Ray couldn't sit still. He paced the perimeter of the gym, checking his phone for updates, listening to every news report, torturing himself with images of what might be happening back at the ranch. The fire burned for 6 days. It consumed 80,000 acres, destroyed 47 homes, killed hundreds of animals, and forever changed the landscape of the valley. Ray didn't sleep more than an hour or two each night, dozing in fits before jerking awake with visions of Rosie surrounded by flames, calling for him, wondering why he didn't come. During those terrible days, Emily drove down from Denver to be with her parents. She found her father gaunt and hollow-eyed, barely eating, spending hours calling animal shelters and rescue organizations, describing Rosie over and over, giving them his contact information in case anyone found a grey donkey with a crescent-shaped scar behind her left ear. "Dad, you need to rest," Emily said gently. "You need to eat something." "I can't," Ray said. "Not while she's out there. Not while she might be scared or hurt or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Emily wrapped her arms around her father and held him while he finally let himself cry, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere so deep they threatened to tear him apart. When they were finally allowed to return, Ray drove back with his heart in his throat. The road was lined with blackened earth and skeletal trees, the devastation so complete it was hard to recognize familiar landmarks. Their ranch house was still standing, spared by a quirk of wind that had pushed the fire around it rather than through it. The barn was damaged but salvageable. The fences were gone. The chicken coop was ash. The land itself looked like the surface of a hostile planet, grey and lifeless and still smoking in places. Ray spent the next 3 weeks searching for Rosie. He walked every inch of the property, then expanded his search to neighboring ranches, to the Forest Service land beyond, to anywhere a frightened donkey might have run. He called for her until his voice was hoarse. He posted flyers in town, contacted every animal shelter within 100 miles, talked to every neighbor and passing stranger who might have seen something. He found remains. Deer, mostly, and a few cattle that hadn't made it to safety. Each time he came across bones, his heart would stop until he could determine they weren't her. The crescent-shaped scar behind her left ear had become the single identifying feature he held onto, the one way he'd know her for certain if he found her. But he didn't find her. Not alive, not dead, not anything. Rosie had simply vanished into the chaos of that terrible day, and no amount of searching could bring her back. The local newspaper ran a story about Ray's search, and people from all over the county called with reported sightings. Each one sent Ray racing to investigate, only to discover it was a different donkey, or a mule, or once, embarrassingly, a large dog seen from a distance. With each false lead, Ray felt hope drain a little more, until he was running on nothing but stubborn refusal to accept the obvious truth. Martha watched her husband exhaust himself in increasingly desperate searches. She saw the way he stood at the fence line each evening, staring toward the mountains, waiting. She saw how he stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping properly, stopped engaging with the work of rebuilding their life. The fire had taken their ranch, but Rosie's disappearance was taking Ray himself, piece by piece, day by day. "She's gone," Martha said gently one night, sitting beside him on the porch. "I know you don't want to hear it, but she's gone. You have to let her go." "I should have found her sooner," Ray said, his voice flat. "I should have checked everywhere before we loaded the horses. I should have. You did everything you could. The fire moved too fast. Even if you'd found her, we might not have made it out. You might have died trying to save her. Maybe that would have been better." Martha's hand found his in the darkness. "Don't say that. Don't you dare say that." They sat together in silence, holding hands, two people trying to navigate a grief that had no clear path forward. Emily had stayed for 2 weeks before having to return to her job in Denver, and she called every night to check on her parents, especially her father, who she worried was sliding into a depression he might not climb out of. Eventually, Ray did what Martha asked. He stopped searching. He focused on rebuilding the ranch, repairing the barn, restocking the cattle. Life demanded forward motion, and he moved forward because there was no other choice. But the work felt hollow now, mechanical, something he did because it needed doing rather than because it brought him any satisfaction or joy. The horses came back from the place where they'd been temporarily boarded, the new cattle arrived, the fences were rebuilt, the chicken coop was reconstructed and restocked with pullets that would become layers. Within a year, the ranch looked almost like it had before the fire, at least to outside eyes. But Ray never stopped thinking about Rosie. In quiet moments, he'd wonder where she'd gone, what had happened, whether she'd suffered. The not knowing was a wound that never quite healed, a question that followed him through the years that came after. When he worked in the barn, he'd sometimes turn, expecting to see her standing there, supervising. When he rode fence lines, he'd listen for the sound of her hooves following behind. When evening came and he sat on the porch, he'd look toward the pasture and see her absence like a hole in the world. Martha tried to convince him to get another donkey, thinking that having an animal to care for might help fill the void, but Ray couldn't bring himself to do it. It felt like betrayal, like he was giving up on Rosie, admitting she was really gone. As long as he didn't replace her, some part of him could believe she might still come home. Time moved on because it always does, indifferent to human grief. The ranch recovered. The valley recovered. Ray's hair went from brown to grey, and his back developed a permanent ache from decades of hard work. Martha stayed beside him, through it all, patient and steady, the anchor that kept him from drifting too far into melancholy. They built a good life from the ashes of their old one, different, but still worthwhile, still meaningful. Emily married a man named David, a software engineer with a kind heart and a good sense of humour. They had 2 children, Jack and Sophie, who became the lights of Ray and Martha's life. The grandchildren would visit during summers and holidays, filling the ranch with noise and energy that reminded Ray what joy felt like, even if it was temporary. But a part of Ray remained forever standing at that fence line, calling for a grey donkey with a crescent-shaped scar, waiting for an answer that never came. Some losses leave marks that time can't erase, scars that remain tender long after the wound should have healed. Rosie's absence became one of those scars, a reminder that love always carries the risk of loss, and that sometimes the things we lose are the things we can never quite replace. 21 years passed, each one carrying Ray a little further from that terrible September afternoon, but the distance of time did nothing to diminish the clarity of his memory. He remembered exactly how Rosie's ears felt under his hand. He remembered the sound of her contented sighing when she stood in the sun. He remembered the way she'd press her head against his chest when she was tired, trusting him completely to hold her steady. He remembered, and remembering, even after all those years, still hurt. Ray retired at 57, his body finally telling him what his mind had refused to accept for years, that he wasn't 27 anymore, that ranching was a young man's game, that there came a time when stubbornness had to give way to reality. He and Martha sold most of their cattle, leased out the grazing land to a younger rancher from 3 valleys over, and settled into a quieter rhythm of life. The barn still housed a few horses, more for companionship than utility, and Martha kept a vegetable garden that produced more squash and tomatoes than 2 people could possibly eat. The adjustment was harder than Ray expected. For 35 years, his identity had been bound up in the work, the daily ritual of feeding and mending and moving, the satisfaction of building something tangible with his hands, the sense of purpose that came from caring for animals who depended on him. Retirement felt less like rest and more like irrelevance, a slow fade into a future where his skills didn't matter and his knowledge wasn't needed. He tried to fill his days with projects, building a new shed, refinishing old furniture, helping Martha with the garden, but nothing quite filled the space that ranching had occupied in his life. He felt adrift, purposeless, like a boat that had slipped its mooring and was drifting slowly out to sea. Martha recognized the restlessness in him, the way he'd wander the property looking for tasks that didn't really need doing, fixing things that weren't actually broken. "You need a project," she told him one morning over coffee, "something beyond this ranch. You've been taking care of animals your whole life. Maybe it's time to help some that really need it." That's how Ray learned about the sanctuary. Martha had heard about it from a friend at church, a small rescue operation on the eastern edge of town that took in abused, neglected, and abandoned farm animals. They were always looking for donations, feed, supplies, money, time. Martha suggested Ray drive over with some of the extra hay they had stored, maybe see if they could use any of the old tack-gathering dust in the barn. Ray agreed, mostly because it gave him something to do. He loaded his truck with hay bales and a box of halters and lead ropes, then headed into town on a Tuesday morning when the November sky was the color of old pewter and the air carried the first real bite of winter. The sanctuary wasn't hard to find, just past the feed store, down a gravel road that wound through scrub oak and pinyon pine, ending at a cluster of weathered buildings and corrals. He parked near what looked like the main barn and climbed out of the truck, his knees protesting the movement in a way they hadn't even 5 years ago. A woman in her 40s emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on her jeans, a smile already forming on her weathered face. "Help you?" she asked. "Ray Ellison. I've got some hay and tack in the truck if you can use it. My wife heard you folks take donations." The woman's smile widened. "Are you kidding? We can always use supplies. I'm Sarah Chen. I run this place, such as it is. Let me get a couple people to help unload." She disappeared back into the barn and returned with 2 younger volunteers, college-aged kids who looked eager to help. They made quick work of transferring the hay bales to the storage area, and Ray found himself drawn into conversation with Sarah about the sanctuary's work. They currently housed 14 horses, 6 goats, 8 sheep, 3 pigs, a small flock of chickens, and 5 donkeys, all rescued from situations of neglect or abuse, all being rehabilitated for eventual adoption. "Would you like a tour?" Sarah asked when the truck was empty. "Might as well see where your donation is going." Ray hesitated. Part of him wanted to get back to the ranch, back to the familiar confines of his own property. But another part, the part that had been feeling increasingly hollow since retirement, was curious. "Sure," he said. "Why not?" Sarah led him through the facilities, introducing him to various animals and telling their stories. There was a draft horse who'd been starved nearly to death by an owner who couldn't afford to feed him, a trio of goats rescued from a hoarding situation, sheep who'd been abandoned when their owner died. Each story was a variation on the same theme, human failure leading to animal suffering, and people like Sarah working to make it right. They were walking toward the back pasture when Ray saw the donkeys. 5 of them, grazing in a paddock near a stand of cottonwoods, their winter coats already coming in thick. Sarah was saying something about their various backgrounds, but Ray wasn't listening anymore. His attention had been captured by one particular donkey, standing slightly apart from the others, an old grey female with a watchful expression and careful way of holding herself that spoke of hard experience. Ray moved toward the fence without quite meaning to, drawn by something he couldn't name. The donkey raised her head and looked at him, her ears swiveling forward. For the moment, they simply stared at each other across the distance, recognition stirring in Ray's chest like a bird testing its wings after a long winter. It couldn't be. After 21 years, in a sanctuary miles from his ranch, the odds were astronomical. And yet, something in the way she stood, the angle of her head, the look in her eyes, resonated in Ray's memory like a tuning fork struck after decades of silence. He climbed through the fence rails, moving slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sarah called out something about being careful, about letting the animals approach him rather than vice versa, but Ray barely heard her. The grey donkey watched him come, not moving, not retreating, just watching with an intensity that made his breath catch. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped. The donkey tilted her head, studying him, and Ray found himself whispering a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Rosie?" The donkey's ears flicked at the sound, but she didn't move. Ray took another step closer, his hands trembling now, 21 years of grief and longing suddenly compressed into this single moment. He needed to see behind her left ear. He needed to know. "It's okay, girl," he said softly, using the same tone he'd used all those years ago, in the flood, in the barn, in the countless quiet hours they'd spent together. "It's okay. I just need to see something." He extended his hand, letting her sniff it, letting her decide whether to accept him. The donkey stretched her neck forward, her nostrils flaring as she took in his scent. Then, slowly, almost tentatively, she took a step toward him. Ray's vision blurred with tears he hadn't given himself permission to shed in 2 decades. He moved his hand gently along her neck, feeling the coarse texture of her winter coat, the solid warmth of her beneath his palm. His fingers found the spot behind her left ear, the place where a crescent-shaped scar should be, if this was who he thought it was, if the universe had decided after all these years to give him back what he'd lost. The scar was there, faded with time but unmistakable, exactly where it had been, exactly the shape he remembered from that first day when he'd stitched her up in the barn while rain hammered on the roof. "Rosie," he breathed, and this time it wasn't a question. The donkey made a sound low in her throat, something between a sigh and a whimper. Then she closed the last bit of distance between them and pressed her head against Ray's chest, right over his heart, exactly the way she used to do when she was tired or content or just wanted to be close. Ray's arms came up around her neck, and he buried his face in her mane, and 21 years of grief came pouring out in great, shaking sobs that he couldn't have stopped if his life depended on it. Rosie stood perfectly still, holding him the way he'd once held her, returning a debt of comfort that had been accruing interest for more than 2 decades. Behind them, Sarah had stopped talking. She stood at the fence, watching the old cowboy and the old donkey, and even without knowing the full story, she understood that she was witnessing something profound, something that didn't happen often in a world that so rarely offered second chances. When Ray could finally speak, his voice was rough with emotion. "Where did you find her? How long has she been here?" Sarah moved closer, her expression a mix of curiosity and amazement. "That's Molly. She came to us about 6 months ago from another rescue that was closing down. They'd had her for years, found her wandering the Forest Service roads up in the mountains, half-starved and pregnant. They estimated she was pretty old even then, maybe 20 or 25. She had the foal, raised it, and has been here ever since. Nobody ever claimed her. Her name is Rosie," Ray said firmly, "and I've been looking for her for 21 years. He told Sarah the story then, still holding Rosie, his hand absently, stroking her neck the way he'd done thousands of times before. He told her about the flood, about the decade they'd spent together, about the fire and the desperate search and the years of not knowing. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her own face, and by the time Ray finished, she was shaking her head in wonder. "I've been doing this work for 15 years, she said quietly. "I've seen a lot of reunions, but nothing like this, nothing even close." Ray pulled back to look at Rosie properly, taking in the changes time had wrought. She was greyer now, her muzzle almost white, her back swayed with age. There were new scars mixed with the old ones, evidence of a hard 21 years. But her eyes were the same, dark and intelligent, and fixed on his face with an attention that felt like coming home. "You said she had a foal?" Ray asked, remembering what Sarah had mentioned. Sarah nodded toward the other end of the paddock, where a younger donkey stood watching, the interaction with evident interest. "That's him. We call him Ash. He's about 5 years old now, born in the mountains sometime after Molly Rosie went missing. He's never been away from her." Ray studied the younger donkey, seeing Rosie's features echoed in his face, the same intelligent eyes and careful bearing. Another piece of the story clicking into place, another layer of loss and survival and stubborn endurance. "Can I visit her?" Ray asked, already knowing he couldn't walk away again, couldn't leave her for a second time, even if it was to an excellent sanctuary run by caring people. Sarah smiled. "You can do better than visit. We're always looking for forever homes for our animals, and Rosie clearly knows you. If you're interested, and if you've got the space and resources, I'm interested," Ray interrupted. "And I've got 40 acres, a barn, and more time than I know what to do with." He paused, glancing at Ash. "Can they be adopted together? I won't separate them." "I wouldn't ask you to," Sarah said. "They're a bonded pair. Where one goes, both go." Ray felt something in his chest unfold, a tightness that had been there so long he'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be. After 21 years, after 2 decades of carrying the weight of loss and guilt and unanswered questions, Here was Rosie. Older, scarred, having survived things he'd probably never fully understand, but alive, present, real, and she remembered him. That was the miracle beyond miracles, that after all this time, through all she'd endured, she'd known him the moment he said her name. The drive home felt surreal. Ray kept expecting to wake up, to discover it had all been a dream born of wishful thinking and too many lonely years. But when he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, the memory of Rosie's head against his chest remained solid and real. Martha came out onto the porch, and one look at Ray's face told her something significant had happened. "What is it?" she asked. "Ray, you're scaring me." "I found her," Ray said, and his voice broke on the words. "Martha, I found Rosie. She's alive. She's been alive this whole time." Martha's hand went to her mouth, her eyes widening. "That's not possible. Ray, are you sure? How can you be sure?" "The scar," Ray said, "behind her left ear. It's her, Martha. I'd stake my life on it, and she knew me. The moment I said her name, she knew me." Martha sat down hard on the porch steps, as if her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "After 21 years, she whispered. "How? Where has she been?" Ray told her everything Sarah had said about Rosie being found in the mountains, about the pregnancy and Ash, about the years bouncing between rescues before ending up at Sarah's sanctuary. Martha listened with tears streaming down her face, and when he finished, she stood and wrapped her arms around him. "You get to bring her home," Martha said. "After all this time, you get to bring her home." The process of bringing Rosie and Ash home took 2 weeks to complete. Sarah needed to do a site visit to make sure Ray's ranch met the sanctuary's standards, and there was paperwork to file, health checks to conduct, and arrangements to make. Ray spent those 2 weeks in a state of anticipation he hadn't experienced since he was young, preparing the barn, reinforcing fences, laying in supplies of feed and bedding and veterinary equipment. Martha watched her husband transform before her eyes. The restless melancholy that had characterized his retirement evaporated, replaced by a focused energy that reminded her of the man he'd been 30 years ago. He rebuilt the shelter in the pasture where Rosie used to spend her afternoons. He cleaned out the stall that had once been hers, as if the intervening decades had been nothing more than a long intermission. He even dug out his old journals from storage, flipping through pages of notes about Rosie's health, her preferences, her personality, trying to remember everything he'd once known about her care. "You're happy?" Martha observed one evening as they sat together at the kitchen table, Ray poring over a list of supplies he wanted to order. Ray looked up, surprised by the observation, and then by his realization that it was true. "Yeah," he said. "I am. I didn't think after all this time, I didn't think I'd ever get the chance to make this right." "You didn't do anything wrong," Martha reminded him gently. "The fire wasn't your fault, I know, but leaving her, not finding her, that's haunted me every day since, and now," his voice caught, "now I get to give her the last years of her life in a place where she's safe and loved. That's more than I ever hoped for." Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "She's lucky to have you. They both are." Ray called Emily to tell her the news. His daughter's reaction was immediate and emotional disbelief, giving way to joy, giving way to tears, as she processed what her father was telling her. "Dad, I don't even have words. It's like a miracle. It feels like one." Ray agreed. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and it'll have been a dream." "When can I come see her?" Emily asked. "The kids need to meet her. Jack and Sophie have heard so many stories about Rosie, but they've never actually met her." "Once she's settled in," Ray promised. "Once she's home and comfortable, then you bring the whole family down and we'll have a proper reunion." The day Sarah brought Rosie and Ash to the ranch, the sky was clear and cold, the kind of November day that promised snow before nightfall. Ray heard the trailer coming up the drive before he saw it, and his heart started hammering in his chest with an intensity that reminded him he wasn't as young as he felt in that moment. He and Martha walked out to meet Sarah as she backed the trailer up near the barn. "Ready?" Sarah asked, climbing out of the truck. Ray nodded, not trusting his voice. Sarah opened the trailer gate, and Ash came down the ramp first, stepping carefully, his eyes wide as he took in the new surroundings. Then Rosie appeared at the top of the ramp, and she paused there, her nose working as she scented the air. Ray moved closer, and Rosie's head came up, her ears swiveling toward him. For a moment she stood perfectly still, and Ray found himself holding his breath, wondering if the magic of their reunion at the sanctuary would translate to this new place, or if he'd imagined the depth of her recognition. Then Rosie descended the ramp and walked directly to Ray, bypassing Sarah, ignoring the new sights and sounds and smells, focused entirely on the man who stood waiting for her. When she reached him, she did exactly what she'd done at the sanctuary, pressed her head against his chest and held it there, a gesture of trust and recognition and profound connection that needed no translation. Ray wrapped his arms around her neck and breathed in the smell of her dust and hay and donkey, utterly familiar even after 21 years. "Welcome home," he whispered. "Welcome home." Martha stood nearby, crying openly, and Sarah had tears in her eyes too. Even the young volunteers who'd come along to help seemed moved by the scene, this old man and old donkey finding their way back to each other after more than 2 decades apart. The settling-in period was easier than Ray expected. Rosie seemed to remember the ranch, or at least to recognize it as safe and welcoming. She explored the barn with Ash following close behind, sniffing at corners and stalls with evident curiosity. She investigated the pasture, the water trough, the shelter Ray had rebuilt. By evening, she'd claimed her old stall as if she'd never left it, and Ash had taken the one next door. Ray spent hours just watching them, memorizing their habits and preferences. Rosie moved more slowly than he remembered, her gait stiff with age, her breath sometimes coming hard after even mild exertion. But her mind was sharp as ever, and her personality, stubborn, sweet, infinitely patient, was exactly as he remembered. She still supervised everything he did in the barn, offering opinions via well-timed snorts and ear flicks. She still claimed the sunniest spot in the pasture for her afternoon naps. She still pressed her head against his chest when she wanted comfort. Ash was different, more cautious, more reactive to sudden movements or unfamiliar sounds. Ray recognized the signs of an animal who'd spent his formative months in survival mode, never quite sure where safety was coming from. But the young donkey was devoted to his mother with a fierceness that moved Ray deeply, and he extended that devotion to Ray as well, seeming to understand that this human was important to Rosie, and therefore important to him. The first snow came a week after their arrival, soft flakes that dusted the ground and caught in Rosie's mane. Ray was in the barn when it started, cleaning stalls, and Rosie was standing in her usual supervisory position. When he looked over at her, she was watching the snow fall through the open barn door with an expression Ray could only describe as peaceful. "You like the snow?" he asked her, setting down the pitchfork and moving to stand beside her. Rosie made a soft sound, something between a sigh and a hum, and leaned against him. They stood together watching the snowfall, and Ray thought about all the years they'd lost, all the winters she'd faced without him, all the storms and struggles and lonely nights. He thought about the foal she'd given birth to alone in the mountains, about the strength it must have taken to not just survive, but to protect and raise Ash through circumstances Ray couldn't even imagine. "You're tough," he said quietly, "tougher than I ever gave you credit for. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you." Rosie turned her head and nuzzled his shoulder, and Ray chose to interpret it as forgiveness, as understanding, as the same grace she'd always extended to him even when he didn't deserve it. The weeks turned into months, and Ray fell into a routine that felt both new and ancient. Every morning he woke before dawn and headed to the barn to feed Rosie and Ash. Every afternoon he spent time grooming them, checking their hooves, monitoring their health. Every evening he sat with them in the barn while they ate their grain, talking to them about his day, about Martha, about memories from the years they'd been apart. Martha sometimes joined him for these evening sessions, and she'd watch her husband with the donkeys and see something she'd thought was lost forever, a lightness, a joy, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Rosie had given Ray back a piece of himself he'd been missing, and Martha was grateful beyond words for that gift. But there were also hard moments, times when Ray confronted the reality that Rosie was old, and her time was limited. She had good days when she seemed almost spry, trotting around the pasture with Ash, braying at mealtimes with youthful enthusiasm. And she had bad days when the arthritis in her hips made walking painful, when her breathing was labored, when she ate little and seemed to retreat into herself. On those bad days, Ray stayed close. He brought her warm mashes to tempt her appetite. He applied liniment to her stiff joints and adjusted her bedding to make her more comfortable. He sat with her in the stall and talked to her the way he used to, steady and low and reassuring, telling her she was safe, telling her she was loved, telling her she didn't have to fight anymore if she was tired. But Rosie always rallied. She'd been a fighter when he pulled her from the flood all those years ago, and she was a fighter still. Morning would come, and she'd be up, ready for breakfast, eager to follow Ray around the barn as if nothing had been wrong. One particularly difficult night in February, Ray stayed in the barn until nearly midnight, worried about Rosie's labored breathing. Martha brought him coffee and a blanket, then sat beside him on a hay bale, both of them watching the old donkey sleep. "You know, she might not have much time left," Martha said gently. "I know," Ray's voice was thick, "but I'm grateful for whatever time we get. Even if it's just months, it's more than I thought I'd ever have. It's more than a lot of people get," Martha agreed. "Most losses are permanent. This getting her back, being able to care for her again, it's a kind of miracle." Ray nodded, knowing she was right. Life rarely offered second chances. The fact that he'd been given one with Rosie was something he'd never take for granted. Rosie's breathing eased as the night wore on, and by morning she was up and demanding breakfast with her usual insistence. Ray fed her and Ash, then spent an hour brushing Rosie's coat until it shone. She stood patiently throughout, occasionally turning her head to nuzzle his arm, and Ray felt a contentment so deep it bordered on pain. This was what mattered. This was what he'd been missing during all those restless months of retirement. Not work for its own sake, but purpose, connection. The privilege of caring for something that depended on him, that trusted him, that loved him in the uncomplicated way animals loved. Sarah from the sanctuary stopped by occasionally to check on Rosie and Ash, and each time she visited, she marveled at the transformation. "They're thriving," she told Ray during one visit, "especially Rosie. You can see it in her eyes, she's happy." "So am I," Ray said simply. And it was true. After 21 years of carrying the weight of loss, after 2 decades of guilt and grief and unanswered questions, Ray had found his way back to something approaching peace. Rosie was home, she was safe, she was loved. And whatever time they had left together, Ray was determined to make every moment count. The scar behind her left ear remained a reminder of where they'd started, a physical mark of the day Ray had pulled her from the flood and decided she was worth saving. But now it meant something more, proof that some bonds transcend time and distance, that some connections can survive fire and separation and the relentless passage of years. Ray had saved Rosie once. In the end, by coming back into his life when he needed her most, she'd saved him too. Winter gave way to spring, and Ray watched Rosie and Ash move through the warming days with a gratitude that felt almost religious. Every morning he woke with a sense of purpose that had been missing from his retirement. Every evening he sat on the porch with Martha, watching the donkeys graze in the golden light, feeling blessed in ways that transcended words. Emily visited in April with Jack and Sophie, now 12 and 10 respectively. The children had heard countless stories about Rosie over the years. Their grandfather's legendary donkey who'd been lost in the fire, and meeting her felt like encountering a figure from mythology, made flesh. "She's beautiful," Sophie whispered, standing at the fence while Rosie approached. "Can I pet her?" "Let her come to you," Ray instructed. "Hold out your hand flat. Let her sniff you first." Sophie did as she was told, and Rosie stretched her neck forward, her nostrils flaring as she investigated this new, small human. After a moment, she took the final step and allowed Sophie to stroke her muzzle. "She's so soft," Sophie said, wonder in her voice. Jack was more interested in Ash, asking Ray questions about where he'd been born, what it had been like for him growing up in the mountains with just his mother. Ray answered as best he could, painting a picture of survival and devotion that clearly captured the boy's imagination. "Do you think she was scared?" Jack asked. "Rosie, I mean, when the fire came and she couldn't find you?" Ray considered the question carefully. "I think she was probably terrified," he said honestly, "but I also think she did what she needed to do to survive. Animals are good at that better than people, sometimes. They focus on what's right in front of them, on getting through the next hour, the next day." "I'm glad she made it," Jack said. "And I'm glad you found each other again." "So am I, buddy," Ray said, his voice thick with emotion. "So am I." In May, Ray noticed Rosie spending more time lying down, her breathing sometimes labored even at rest. He called the veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Moss, who examined Rosie carefully before delivering news Ray had been dreading. "Her heart is weakening," Patricia said quietly. "Given her age and everything she's been through, she's doing remarkably well. But Ray, you need to prepare yourself. She might have months, but the clock is running." Ray nodded, his throat tight. He'd known this conversation was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. In a way, nothing else could. "Is she in pain?" he asked. "Not yet. When that changes, we'll manage it. But for now, she's comfortable. Just old." Ray spent the rest of that day sitting with Rosie in the pasture, his back against the cottonwood tree, Rosie standing nearby while Ash grazed in lazy circles. Ray talked to her about everything and nothing, memories from their first decade together, observations about the weather, plans for improving the barn. "I'm grateful," Ray told her as the sun began to set, "for all of it, for finding you that day in the flood, for the years we had before the fire, for getting you back when I'd given up hope. Whatever time we have left, it's more than I deserve." Rosie sighed, a deep, contented sound, and Ray let himself believe she understood. As summer deepened, Ray documented everything, photographs, journal entries, recordings of Rosie's daily routines. He interviewed Sarah about Rosie's time at the sanctuary, tracked down volunteers from the original rescue organization that had found her in the mountains. Each conversation added another layer to his understanding of the 21 years they'd been apart. The picture that emerged was one of extraordinary survival. Rosie had fled the fire into terrain that should have killed her. She'd found water sources, learned which plants were safe to eat, avoided predators that would have seen a lone donkey as easy prey. At some point she'd encountered a wild burro, resulting in her pregnancy with Ash. She'd given birth in the mountains, probably in late spring, when the weather was mild enough for a newborn to survive, and then she'd kept that foal alive through his vulnerable first months and into his first winter. The rescue organization that eventually found them described Rosie as severely malnourished but fiercely protective of Ash, refusing to be separated from him, even when it meant she couldn't receive medical care as quickly as she needed. They'd been together in various rescue situations for nearly 5 years before ending up at Sarah's sanctuary, passed from one overloaded organization to another, never quite finding a permanent home. Through it all, Rosie had remained devoted to Ash, and Ash had remained devoted to her. It was a story of maternal love that transcended circumstance, of a bond that had sustained them both through years that would have broken lesser creatures. One particularly hot July afternoon, Ray was hosing down the barn when he heard Rosie braying, urgent, insistent, worried. He dropped the hose and ran to the pasture, his heart pounding with the fear he'd been carrying since Patricia's diagnosis. He found Ash on the ground, legs thrashing, clearly in distress. Ray's ranch experience kicked in immediately. Colic, probably brought on by the heat, and possibly dehydration or bad forage. He called Patricia while trying to keep Ash calm, but it was Rosie who did the real work. She stood over her son, nuzzling him, making low sounds of comfort, her presence somehow calming him when nothing else could. Patricia arrived quickly and confirmed Ray's diagnosis. With treatment and careful management, Ash recovered over the next few days, but the incident shook Ray profoundly. He'd been so focused on Rosie's mortality that he'd almost forgotten Ash could be vulnerable too. The young donkey had become part of Ray's heart, without him quite realizing it, another creature he'd be devastated to lose. Rosie never left Ash's side during his recovery. She stood guard over him in the barn, barely eating, refusing to be separated, even when Ray tried to give her a break. It was only when Ash was clearly on the mend that she finally relaxed, allowing herself to graze and rest normally again. Watching them together, Ray was struck anew by the depth of their bond. Rosie had protected Ash through circumstances that would have destroyed most animals. She'd raised him alone, kept him alive through mountain winters and bitter, near starvation and the chaos of multiple rescue situations. That kind of devotion transcended normal animal behavior. It was love in its purest form, uncomplicated by doubt or resentment or any of the things that made human relationships so difficult. Ray made a quiet promise to himself that night. Whatever happened to Rosie, whenever that inevitable day came, he would make sure Ash was cared for. He would honor Rosie's 21 years of maternal sacrifice by ensuring her son had a good life, a safe home, someone who understood what he'd lost and would help him through it. It was the least he could do, the very least. As autumn arrived, Ray found himself acutely aware of the passage of time in ways he'd never been before. Each day with Rosie felt precious, borrowed, a gift he hadn't earned but would treasure for as long as it lasted. He took more photographs, wrote longer journal entries, spent more hours simply sitting with her in companionable silence. Martha worried. He was preparing too hard for loss, that he was grieving in advance rather than fully enjoying the present. But Ray couldn't help himself. He'd lost Rosie once without warning, without the chance to say goodbye. If he was going to lose her again, and Patricia had made clear that day was coming, he wanted to be ready. He wanted to have said everything that needed saying. He wanted Rosie to know, beyond any doubt, that she was loved. In early February, on a morning when fog lay thick in the valley and the temperature hovered just above freezing, Ray woke with a feeling of unease he couldn't name. He dressed quickly and headed to the barn, moving faster than his 70-year-old knees wanted to go. He found Rosie down in her stall, lying on her side, breathing but clearly in distress. Ash stood over her, making anxious sounds, his distress palpable. Ray dropped to his knees beside Rosie, running his hands over her body, checking for injuries or obvious problems. Her eyes were open, but unfocused, her breathing shallow and rapid. Ray called Patricia, his voice shaking. She promised to come immediately, told him to keep Rosie warm and calm, not to try moving her. Ray hung up and did exactly that, pulling blankets over Rosie's body, talking to her in that same low, steady voice he'd used 30 years ago in the flood. "You're okay," he told her, though he wasn't sure it was true. "You're going to be okay. Patricia's coming. We'll figure this out." Martha appeared in the barn door, took one look at the scene, and came to kneel beside her husband. She didn't say anything, just put her hand on Ray's shoulder and stayed there, offering silent support. Patricia arrived 20 minutes later and immediately began her examination. Ray watched her face, trying to read her expression, trying to prepare himself for what she might say. When she finally looked up, her eyes were sad. "It's her heart," Patricia said quietly. "It's giving out. This is what I was worried about." "Can you fix it?" Ray asked, though he already knew the answer. "No. I'm sorry, Ray. But no. Hearts don't heal at her age, not from this kind of weakness. I can give her something to ease her breathing, make her more comfortable, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We need to talk about what comes next." Ray felt like the ground was tilting beneath him. This was too soon. They'd had barely a year together. After 21 years apart, 1 year wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "How long?" he managed to ask. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. But Ray, she's suffering. Her body is failing, and there's nothing we can do to stop it." "The kindest thing." "No." The word came out harder than Ray intended. "Not yet. If she's got days, I want those days. I want every minute." Patricia looked at Martha, who gave a slight nod. "Okay," Patricia said. But Ray, you need to watch her closely. If she gets worse, if she's in pain, you need to call me. Don't let her suffer for your sake. I'll call you, Ray promised. I won't let her suffer. I need a little more time. Patricia gave Rosie an injection to help her breathing, then showed Ray how to monitor her condition. What signs to watch for that would indicate she was declining beyond what could be managed. Before she left, she hugged Ray tightly. You gave her a good last year, she said. A safe place, love, everything she needed. Whatever happens now, you did right by her. After Patricia left, Ray settled into the stall beside Rosie. He'd brought his sleeping bag from the house, along with a thermos of coffee and a lunch Martha had packed. He had no intention of leaving Rosie's side. Not now. Not with time running out. Martha understood. She made regular trips to the barn with food and fresh coffee, sitting with Ray for hours at a time, both of them keeping vigil over the old donkey who'd meant so much to their family. Ash remained close too, lying near his mother, occasionally standing to nuzzle her or check that she was still breathing. Rosie slept most of that first day, her breathing laboured but steady. Whenever she woke, Ray was there, talking to her, stroking her neck, reminding her she was loved. He told her stories about their years together before the fire, recounting memories of cattle drives and desert crossings and quiet evenings under open skies. He told her about the 21 years they'd been apart, how he'd searched for her, how he'd never stopped missing her. I thought I'd lost you forever, Ray said, his voice breaking. And then you came back, and it was like getting a piece of my heart returned that I didn't even know was missing. This year with you, it's been the best year of my retirement. The best year of my life in a long time. You gave me that, Rosie. You gave me purpose again. Rosie's ear flicked at the sound of his voice, and Ray took that as acknowledgement, as understanding, as the same connection they'd always shared. Night fell, and Ray refused Martha's suggestion that he come inside for a few hours of real sleep. He couldn't leave. Every moment mattered now, every minute was precious beyond measure. He dozed fitfully in the sleeping bag, waking at every sound, checking on Rosie constantly. The second day was harder. Rosie's breathing became more laboured despite the medication, and she showed no interest in the warm mashes Ray prepared. She drank a little water when he held a bucket for her, but even that seemed to exhaust her. Ray could see the life draining from her eyes, could feel her slipping away despite his desperate desire to hold on. By evening, Ray knew he was out of time. Rosie wasn't going to recover. She wasn't going to rally. She was dying, and holding on any longer was selfish, was choosing his need over her comfort. It was the hardest truth he'd ever had to face, but he faced it because that's what love required. He called Patricia. She came within the hour, carrying her bag, her expression understanding and sad. Ray explained what he'd seen, and Patricia examined Rosie one more time. When she looked up, she nodded. "It's time," she said gently. "She's ready." Ray felt something crack open in his chest, but he nodded. "Okay, let's give her peace." Martha had arrived when Ray called Patricia, and now she stood beside her husband, her hand in his, both of them crying openly. Patricia prepared the injection, moving with quiet efficiency, explaining what would happen, making sure Ray understood. "It'll be gentle," Patricia promised. "She won't feel pain, she'll just drift off, like falling asleep." Ray positioned himself at Rosie's head, cradling her muzzle in his lap. Ash stood nearby, sensing something significant was happening, his distress evident in every line of his body. Martha knelt beside Ray, her hand on Rosie's shoulder. "You're the bravest creature I've ever known," Ray told Rosie, his tears falling on her grey coat. "You survived things that should have killed you. You raised your son alone in the wilderness. You never gave up. Not once. And when you found your way back to me, Rosie, that was the greatest gift I've ever received." He paused, stroking behind her ear, his fingers finding the crescent-shaped scar one last time. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for letting me make things right. Thank you for teaching me that some bonds survive anything, fire, time, distance, everything. I love you, girl. I always have, and I always will." Patricia administered the injection. Rosie's breathing, which had been laboured and painful, began to ease. Her eyes, which had been clouded with discomfort, grew calm. Ray held her, whispering words of love and comfort, feeling her relax against him as the medication took effect. It took less than a minute. One moment Rosie was breathing, her heart beating beneath Ray's hand, and the next she was still, gone, at peace. The silence in the barn was absolute. Ray held her for a long time afterward, unable to let go, unable to accept that she was really gone. Martha stayed beside him, crying quietly, her presence a steady anchor. Even Patricia waited respectfully, giving them the time they needed to begin processing their grief. Finally, Ray gently laid Rosie's head down and stood, his body feeling like it belonged to someone else. He looked at Ash, who was standing frozen, staring at his mother's still form. The young donkey made a sound of distress, and Ray went to him, putting his arms around Ash's neck. "I know," Ray said, his voice raw. "I know, buddy. She's gone. But you're not alone. You'll never be alone. I promise you that." Ash pressed against Ray, seeking comfort, and Ray gave it freely, mourning alongside the donkey who'd just lost his mother, his protector, his entire world. They buried Rosie on a hillside, overlooking the ranch, in a spot where she'd like to graze in the evenings. Ray and Martha dug the grave themselves, refusing help from neighbors who offered, needing the physical labor as a way to channel grief into something productive. It took them most of a day, working in shifts, their backs aching and hands blistered by the time they finished. Sarah came to the service, as did Patricia and Emily with her children and David. They stood together in the cold February wind, while Ray said words that felt inadequate to capture what Rosie had meant, what she'd represented, what her return and loss had taught him. "She was a fighter," Ray said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. "She survived when she shouldn't have. She raised Ash alone in the mountains, kept him alive through winters that killed stronger animals. She found her way back to me after 21 years, and she gave me one more year to get it right, to show her she was loved, to say a proper goodbye." He paused, looking at the grave, at the simple marker he'd carved with her name, and the dates they'd been together. 31 years, separated by 21 years, bookending a life that had been harder than any creature should have to endure. "I'm grateful," Ray continued, "for all of it, for saving her from the flood, for the decade we had before the fire, for her surviving when I thought she was gone, for the impossible reunion. For this last year, I'm grateful, and I'll carry her with me for whatever time I have left." They lowered Rosie into the grave, and Ray placed with her a few things he thought she should have: a worn halter from their first years together, a photograph of the two of them from before the fire, and a handful of oats from the last batch she'd eaten. Then they covered the grave, piling earth and stones until it was complete. Emily hugged her father when it was done. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I know how much she meant to you. She taught me something important," Ray said, "about holding on and letting go, about being present for the time we have, rather than grieving in advance for the time we won't. I'm sad she's gone, but I'm not sorry we found each other again. Some people never get that chance." After everyone left, Ray sat by the grave until sunset, talking to Rosie the way he always had, saying the things he'd forgotten to say while she was alive, thanking her for lessons he was still learning. Martha eventually came to lead him back to the house, but even there his attention remained divided, pulled toward the hillside where Rosie rested. The hardest part was Ash. The young donkey spent days standing at the fence line nearest to where Rosie was buried, braying occasionally, his distress evident in every line of his body. He barely ate, and when he did eat, it was only because Ray brought food directly to him and stood there until he took a few bites. The grief was transforming Ash before Ray's eyes, and there was nothing Ray could do except be present, offer comfort, and hope it was enough. Ray moved a cot into the barn so he could sleep near Ash, not wanting the donkey to be alone in his grief. They were partners in loss now, both mourning the same extraordinary creature, both trying to figure out how to move forward when forward seemed impossible. "I miss her too," Ray told Ash one night, sitting in the stall while the donkey stood nearby. "Every minute of every day I miss her. But you know what? She'd want us to keep going. She didn't survive all those years in the mountains just so we could give up now. She'd want us to live. to take care of each other, to honor her by being strong the way she was strong. Ash's ear swiveled toward Ray's voice, and Ray took that as a sign that his words were landing, that maybe they were starting to reach through the fog of grief. Weeks passed, and gradually, incrementally, both Ray and Ash began to heal. It wasn't linear. There were setbacks and hard days and moments when the loss felt as fresh as it had in those first terrible hours. But there were also moments of peace, times when Ray could think about Rosie without the immediate crush of grief, when Ash could graze without constantly looking toward the grave on the hillside. Ray continued his documentation project, but its nature changed. Instead of collecting stories about Rosie's survival, he began writing about what she'd taught him, about resilience, about the capacity of living things to endure and adapt and ultimately thrive despite circumstances that should break them, about love as an active choice rather than a passive feeling. He wrote about the crescent-shaped scar behind Rosie's ear and what it represented, a mark left by tragedy that became a symbol of survival, a way to identify what had been lost when it was finally found. He wrote about how the scar had been his roadmap back to Rosie, the single piece of evidence that bridged 21 years and hundreds of miles and impossible odds. Martha read what Ray was writing and encouraged him to compile it into something more formal. "Other people need to hear this story," she said. "It's not just about you and Rosie. It's about hope, about second chances, about the bonds that survive everything. That means something." Ray wasn't sure he wanted to share something so personal, but he kept writing anyway, letting the words flow as a form of processing, of making sense of everything that had happened. The act of writing became its own kind of therapy, a way to honor Rosie by ensuring her story was told completely, honestly, without the sentimentality that would have diminished its truth. In March, Emily came to visit again, this time without the children. She wanted to check on her father, to make sure he was coping, to offer support in person rather than over the phone. She found him in better shape than she'd feared, still grieving, but functional, moving through his days with purpose, if not joy. They walked together to Rosie's grave, now marked with early spring wildflowers that Martha had planted. "Tell me about the year you had with her," Emily said. "The good parts. I want to know what it was like. Having her back," Ray told her. About the reunion at the sanctuary, about bringing Rosie and Ash home, about the routines they'd established and the quiet moments that had meant the most. About Rosie's personality unchanged despite everything she'd been through and the way she'd press her head against his chest when she was tired. About the peace he'd felt, having her back in his life, having the chance to care for her properly this time. "It sounds perfect," Emily said when he finished. "It wasn't perfect," Ray corrected gently. "She was old and sick, and I knew from the start that time was limited. But it was good, it was real, and it was enough." Emily linked her arm through her father's. "You're different than you were before she came back, more at peace, maybe. Even with her gone, you seem more settled than you did during your first years of retirement." Ray considered that. "Rosie taught me that the past doesn't have to stay past. Sometimes it circles back around, gives you another chance to get things right. And even when that chance is brief, even when it ends in loss, it's still worth it. I spent 21 years wishing I could have said goodbye to her properly. This time, I got to. That matters." They stood together at the grave, watching the sun sink toward the mountains, turning the sky orange and purple and gold. Ray thought about the evenings he'd spent with Rosie, watching sunsets just like this, feeling content in a way he hadn't felt in years. That contentment was gone now, replaced by grief, but underneath the grief was something else, gratitude, the bone-deep certainty that he'd been given a gift most people never received, and that the gift had been worth every moment of pain it cost. As spring deepened into summer, Ray found himself thinking less about Rosie's death and more about her life, both the parts he'd witnessed and the parts he'd only learned about later. He thought about her surviving the flood, the fire, 21 years in the mountains. He thought about her raising Ash alone, protecting him through circumstances that should have killed them both. He thought about her strength, her resilience, her stubborn refusal to give up, Those qualities had always been in her, Ray realized. Even when she was young and frightened and half drowned in the cottonwood roots, the core of who she was had already been present. Ray hadn't created her strength by rescuing her. He'd simply given her the chance to develop it, to become fully herself. And when circumstances took that safety away, Rosie had found her strength within herself and survived. That realization changed something in Ray. He'd spent years feeling guilty about the fire, about not finding Rosie before they evacuated, about the 21 years she'd spent surviving without him. But maybe he'd been thinking about it wrong. Maybe Rosie hadn't needed him to survive. She'd proven that beyond any doubt. Maybe what she'd needed was to be seen, to be recognized, to have someone witness her life and say it mattered. He'd done that. In the year they'd had together at the end, he'd witnessed her fully. He'd documented her story, honored her survival, given her a safe place to spend her final months. He'd loved her completely, without reservation, without qualification. And when the time came, he'd made the hardest decision. Love sometimes requires to let her go with dignity and peace. Ray shared these thoughts with Martha one evening as they sat on the porch, Ash grazing in the pasture below them. Martha listened quietly, then said, "You gave each other gifts. She gave you purpose and connection. You gave her safety and love. Neither of you could have been who you became without the other." It was true. Ray was a different person because he'd known Rosie, more patient, more attentive to the needs of creatures who couldn't speak their own defense, more aware of his capacity to impact other lives simply by choosing to care, more convinced that small acts of kindness rippled outward in ways that couldn't always be measured but were nonetheless real. Summer brought visitors, friends from town, neighbors from surrounding ranches, people who'd heard about Rosie's story and wanted to express their condolences or share their own stories of loss and reunion. Ray welcomed them all, finding comfort in the community that formed around shared experience, around the universal truth that love and loss were inseparable parts of being alive. Sarah from the sanctuary became a regular visitor, bringing updates about other rescued animals, occasionally asking Ray's advice about difficult cases. During one visit in late June, she brought unexpected news that would change everything Ray thought he understood about Rosie's story. "After Rosie died, I started thinking more about where she'd come from," Sarah said, "about the mountain population, about how she survived all those years. So I reached out to Margaret Cole. She runs a private sanctuary about 40 miles from here. I thought she might have information about donkeys in that area." Sarah paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "Ray, Margaret contacted me back with something incredible. About 15 years ago, she took in a pregnant donkey that had been wandering the Forest Service roads. The donkey gave birth to twins, 2 females, Margaret named Stella and Luna. The mother died when the twins were about 6 months old. Ray felt his heart start to beat faster, though he wasn't sure why. The mother had a crescent-shaped scar behind her left ear," Sarah said softly. "Exactly like Rosie's." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Ray stared at Sarah, trying to process what she was saying. I think that donkey was Rosie's mother, or sister, or some other close relative, and I think these twins might be Rosie's, daughters or half-sisters. Margaret has photographs, records, everything. She wants to meet you." Ray couldn't speak. He sat there on the porch, his mind racing through implications he wasn't ready to face. Rosie hadn't been alone. She'd had family up there, or had encountered family, or had come from a line of donkeys who'd been surviving in those mountains for who knew how long. "When can I meet her?" Ray asked, his voice rough. "Right now, if you want. She's expecting us." Ray looked at Martha, who was already nodding. They called Emily, and within the hour, all 3 of them were in Sarah's truck, driving up into the mountains toward Margaret Cole's sanctuary. The drive took 45 minutes, winding through increasingly remote terrain. Margaret's place was smaller than Sarah's sanctuary, but meticulously maintained. She met them at the gate, a woman in her 70s with weathered skin and kind eyes, the look of someone who'd spent decades caring for creatures who couldn't care for themselves. "Ray Ellison," she said, extending her hand. "I can't tell you how much your story about Rosie moved me." And then When I realized the connection, she shook her head. Come, let me show you. She led them to a pasture where 2 grey donkeys grazed. They were younger than Rosie had been, probably in their mid-teens, and they looked up at the approaching humans with intelligent, curious eyes. Ray felt his breath catch. The resemblance wasn't subtle. These donkeys looked like Rosie might have looked at that age before the hardest years, before the scars accumulated, but with the same fundamental features that had made her recognizable. Stella and Luna, Margaret said, gesturing to the donkeys. Twins born to a rescued donkey I called Grace. Grace had that same crescent scar you described behind her left ear, exactly where Rosie's was. I remember it clearly because it was so distinctive. Do you have pictures of Grace? Martha asked. Margaret nodded and pulled out her phone, scrolling through old photographs until she found what she was looking for. She handed the phone to Ray. The donkey in the photograph was thinner than Rosie had ever been, more worn down, but the facial structure was nearly identical. And there, clearly visible in one close-up shot, was a crescent-shaped scar behind the left ear. How is this possible? Ray breathed. Margaret sat down on a nearby bench, and the others joined her. I've been thinking about this non-stop since I read your story. Here's what I think happened, what I've been able to piece together from rescue records and conversations with Forest Service rangers. She explained that there had been a small population of feral donkeys living in the Kudeta mountains for decades, descendants of animals released or escaped from old mining operations. Most people didn't know about them because they stayed deep in the wilderness, only occasionally crossing paths with humans. The Forest Service had tried to manage the population, but had largely left them alone since they weren't causing problems. I think Rosie came from that population originally, Margaret said. Maybe she was born wild, or maybe she was born domestic and got loose young. Either way, she ended up in your flood at a young age. You rescued her, raised her, and she lived with you for a decade. Then the fire happened, Ray said, following the thread. Then the fire happened, and Rosie fled back into the mountains, maybe following old instincts, maybe just running blind. Up there, she encountered other donkeys. Maybe her mother, maybe siblings, maybe just distant relatives. She lived with them, integrated into their group. She got pregnant probably by a wild burro like you thought, and had Ash. Margaret pulled out more photographs, laying out a timeline. 2 years after Rosie had Ash, Grace showed up on the Forest Service roads, pregnant and starving. That would have been about 15 years ago. Grace had the Dunvor twins, then died 6 months later. I've always wondered where she came from, why she came down from the mountains at that particular time. You think Grace was related to Rosie? Martha said. I think Grace was Rosie's mother, or possibly an older sister. The scar is too distinctive to be coincidence. And if that's true, then Stella and Luna are Rosie's half-sisters, which means, Margaret turned to look at Ray directly, which means you have living family members of Rosie's, genetic relatives who carry her bloodline forward. Ray stood and walked to the fence, studying Stella and Luna with new eyes. They'd moved closer during the conversation, curious about the visitors, and now stood a few feet away, watching him with expressions that were eerily reminiscent of Rosie's careful evaluation of new situations. Can I meet them? Ray asked. Margaret smiled. I was hoping you'd ask. She opened the gate and led Ray into the pasture, with Martha, Emily, and Sarah following. Stella, the bolder of the two, approached first, stretching her neck to sniff Ray's extended hand. When he moved his hand to scratch behind her ears, his fingers found it, without conscious thought, a small raised line of scar tissue in the exact spot where Rosie's had been. She has it too, Ray said, his voice shaking. Margaret nodded. So does Luna. That's actually what made me start researching genetic markers in donkeys. Scars aren't usually hereditary, but there are some conditions that create susceptibility to injury in specific locations. I think there might be a structural quirk in this bloodline that makes that particular spot vulnerable. Ray moved to Luna next, finding the same scar in the same location. It was smaller than Rosie's had been, less pronounced, but unmistakably present. Genetic proof of relationship, physical evidence that he was standing with Rosie's family, that the story didn't end with her death. What happens to them? Ray asked Margaret. Do they stay? Here, they can stay as long as I'm able to care for them, Margaret said. But I'm 73, Ray. I'm starting to think about succession planning, about what happens to my animals when I can't do this anymore. Most of them will be adopted out or transferred to other sanctuaries. Stella and Luna included. Ray looked at Martha and Emily, both of whom were already nodding before he could ask the question. We have room, Martha said. And you know you want to. Ray turned back to the donkeys, watching the way they interacted with each other, the same kind of close bond Rosie and Ash had shared. He thought about what it would mean to bring them home, to care for Rosie's genetic legacy, to give these creatures the same safety and love he'd given their sister. Can I? He asked Margaret. Can I give them a home? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Ray, I can't think of anything that would make me happier. Knowing they'd go to someone who understands their bloodline, who knew. Rosie, who would honor that connection, yes. Absolutely yes. The logistics took several weeks to arrange. Ray needed to prepare additional shelter and fencing, needed to make sure Ash would accept new companions, needed to coordinate with Margaret on the transfer. But on a warm day in early April, almost exactly 2 years after Rosie had come back into his life, Stella and Luna arrived at Ray's ranch. Ash was curious but not hostile, approaching the new donkeys with careful sniffing and ear-flicking. The three of them established a hierarchy quickly. Ash as the senior member by virtue of having been there first, Stella and Luna as the newcomers who needed to learn the territory. Within a week, they were grazing together like they'd been a herd for years. Ray found himself watching them constantly, seeing echoes of Rosie in their movements and behaviors. Stella had Rosie's stubborn streak, her insistence on supervising any work Ray did in the barn. Luna had Rosie's gentleness, her willingness to stand patiently while children pet her or visitors took photographs. Both of them had the crescent scars that marked them as part of something larger than themselves, a bloodline that had survived against impossible odds, that had adapted and endured, and ultimately thrived. The discovery of Stella and Luna recontextualized everything Ray thought he'd known about Rosie's story. She hadn't been alone in the mountains. She'd been part of a community, part of a genetic line that had been surviving up there for who knew how many generations. Her strength wasn't just individual, it was hereditary, passed down through mothers and daughters who'd all learned to endure. Ray started researching the feral donkey population in the mountains, connecting with Forest Service rangers and wildlife biologists who documented the group over the years. What he learned amazed him. The population had been stable for at least 40 years, maybe longer. They'd developed survival strategies specifically adapted to the harsh mountain environment. They'd created social structures that protected vulnerable members. They'd, in essence, re-wilded themselves while maintaining the hardiness that domestic donkeys were bred for. Rosie came from survivors. Ray told Martha one evening as they watched Stella, Luna, and Ash graze together in the pasture. Generation after generation of donkeys who refused to give up, who adapted, who found ways to live in a place that should have killed them. That's what was in her blood. That's what kept her alive all those years. Martha squeezed his hand. And now that bloodline continues here, with you. You're protecting something important, Ray. Not just individual animals, but a genetic legacy that represents resilience and adaptation and survival. The story took on new dimensions. Ray updated his manuscript about Rosie, adding the information about Stella and Luna and the mountain population. A local magazine published an excerpt, and the response was overwhelming. People from across the state contacted Ray, moved by Rosie's story, inspired to support animal rescue efforts, wanting to know more about the feral donkey population. A documentary filmmaker reached out, proposing a project that would tell the broader story of feral equid populations in the Southwest, using Rosie's journey as the emotional center. Ray was hesitant at first, protective of his privacy, and worried about exploiting Rosie's memory. But the filmmaker, a woman named Catherine Wu, who'd made her reputation with thoughtful, unsentimental nature documentaries, convinced him that the story deserved to reach beyond his personal circle. "This isn't just about one man and one donkey," Catherine said during their first meeting. "It's about how we think about wild versus domestic, about what happens when animals adapt to circumstances we think should kill them, about the bonds that transcend species. If we can tell Rosie's story well, we might actually change how people think about feral populations, maybe even influence policy." Ray agreed to participate, and over the following months, Catherine and her small crew documented life on the ranch. They filmed Ray with Stella, Luna, and Ash. They interviewed Sarah and Margaret and Patricia. They captured footage of the mountain population, working with Forest Service rangers to get shots of the wild donkeys in their natural habitat. They wove together Ray's personal narrative with scientific context, creating something that was part love story, part survival tale, part conservation advocacy. The documentary aired on a major streaming platform the following spring, and the response exceeded everyone's expectations. Millions of people watched Rosie's story, and many were moved to take action, adopting rescue animals, donating to sanctuaries, contacting their representatives about policies affecting feral equid populations. Ray received hundreds of messages from viewers who'd been touched by the story. Some shared their own experiences with rescue animals. Some thanked him for demonstrating the importance of never giving up hope. Some simply wanted to express how much the story had meant to them, how it had helped them through their own grief or inspired them to look at animals differently. The attention was overwhelming at first. Ray had never sought the spotlight, had always thought of himself as a simple rancher who'd happened to love a remarkable donkey. But as he read through the messages and saw the tangible impact Rosie's story was having, he began to understand that sharing her life wasn't exploitation, it was testimony. It was bearing witness to something extraordinary, ensuring that Rosie's survival and the lessons it taught wouldn't be forgotten. Emily and her family visited that summer, and the children were amazed by how famous their grandfather had become. Jack, now 14 and serious about pursuing veterinary medicine, had watched the documentary 3 times and could quote entire passages from his grandfather's narration. "You made a difference, Grandpa," Jack said, as they sat together on the porch, watching the 3 donkeys graze in the evening light. "Because of Rosie's story, there are donkeys who won't be rounded up and removed from the mountains. There are rescue organizations getting funding they desperately needed. There are people adopting animals who would have stayed in shelters. That's huge." Ray felt a complicated mix of pride and humility. He'd simply loved Rosie, simply done what seemed right at each step of the journey. That those actions had rippled outward in ways he'd never imagined felt less like personal accomplishment and more like grace, being in the right place at the right time with the right heart to recognize what mattered. As autumn arrived, Ray found himself thinking about legacies and continuations. He was 71 now, his body showing the accumulated wear of a long life, lived physically. His knees ached in the mornings, his back protested extended periods of work, his heart, damaged by the attack years ago, required careful monitoring and medication. He knew his time was finite, knew that the question wasn't if, but when he'd have to pass the responsibility for caring for the donkeys to someone else. Emily had found property near the ranch and was slowly developing it to accommodate the animals when that transition became necessary. She'd left her job in Denver and was working remotely, spending increasing amounts of time helping Ray with the daily care, learning everything he could teach her about Stella, Luna, and Ash. "I want you to know," Emily told him one October evening as they stood together at Rosie's grave, "that when the time comes, I'll take care of them. Not out of obligation, but because I understand what they represent, because I saw what Rosie meant to you, and I want to honor that." Ray felt tears prick his eyes. "That's all I could ask for," he said. "Knowing they'll be safe, that they'll stay together, that someone who understands their significance will be their guardian, that's everything." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The grave was well tended now, surrounded by wildflowers that bloomed from spring through fall. Martha had planted them, saying that Rosie deserved to rest in beauty, surrounded by life, even in death. "Do you think she knew?" Emily asked. "At the end, I mean. Do you think Rosie understood how much she mattered?" Ray considered the question carefully. "I think animals don't measure mattering the way we do. They don't think about legacies or impact or being remembered, but I think Rosie knew she was loved. I think she felt safe with me, trusted me completely. And I think that was enough for her, not the big cosmic significance we've built around her story, but the simple daily reality of being cared for." "That's beautiful," Emily said, softly. "And it's true for people too, isn't it? At the end, what matters isn't how many people knew us or what we accomplished. It's whether we loved and were loved, whether we made the people and creatures in our immediate circle feel safe and valued." "Exactly," Ray agreed. "Everything else is just—" He gestured vaguely toward the mountains, the valley, the vast sky. "Just us trying to make sense of being alive, trying to create meaning from the fact that we're here and then we're not." They walked back down the hillside together as darkness fell, Ray moving more slowly than he once had, Emily matching her pace to his. At the barn, the 3 donkeys were waiting for their evening feed, and the simple ritual of caring for them grounded Ray in the present moment, in the work that needed doing, in the love that needed expressing. This was his life, now smaller in scope than it had been during his ranching years, but deeper in ways that mattered more. He'd learned, through Rosie, that significance wasn't measured in acres or cattle or productivity. It was measured in connection, in the quality of attention paid to other living things, in the willingness to show up day after day and do the work that love required. Winter came early that year, bringing heavy snows that tested Ray's aging body. Emily took over more of the daily work, insisting that her father rest when the cold made his joints ache, when his heart protested extended exertion. Ray resisted at first, hating to admit his limitations, but eventually he accepted that this too was part of the journey, learning to let go gradually, preparing for the ultimate transition by practicing smaller ones. The donkeys adjusted to Emily's increased presence with typical equine adaptability. They still nickered when Ray approached, still pressed their heads against his chest, but they also began seeking Emily out for attention, for treats, for the companionship that was becoming as natural with her as it had been with Ray. "You're doing good work," Ray told his daughter one snowy December morning as they stood in the barn watching the donkeys eat. "They trust you. That's the most important thing. I learned from the best," Emily said, linking her arm through his. "You showed me what it means to really care for something, to make their welfare your responsibility, not just today, but forever. That's a gift, Dad." As the year turned, and Ray entered his 72nd year, he found himself thinking less about his own mortality and more about what would remain after he was gone. The donkeys would continue. Stella and Luna were still relatively young, could live another 15 or 20 years with proper care. Ash would be with them, the living link to Rosie, the son she'd protected through impossible circumstances. The story would continue too. Catherine was working on a follow-up documentary exploring the broader conservation implications of feral equid populations. Universities were using Rosie's case study in their animal behavior and ethics curricula. Policymakers were citing the research that had emerged from studying Stella and Luna when making decisions about how to manage wild horse and donkey populations. Most importantly, the lessons would continue. Everyone who'd heard Rosie's story, who'd been moved by it, who'd been inspired to see animals differently or to pursue careers in animal welfare, or to simply pay more attention to the creatures who shared their lives, they carried forward something essential that Rosie had represented. Ray sat down one evening in late winter to write what he thought of as his final letter to Rosie. It was something he'd been putting off, knowing that once he wrote it, he'd be admitting that their story really was over, that he'd said everything that needed saying. "Dear Rosie," he began, then paused, pen hovering over paper. "How do you summarize a lifetime? How do you capture in words what a bond means when that bond has survived flood and fire and 21 years of separation?" Ray sat for a long time, thinking about where to begin, what to say, how to honor the full complexity of what Rosie had meant to him. Finally, he started writing. Asterisk, dear Rosie, asterisk, asterisk, it's been almost 3 years since you left. The grief has changed shape. It's no longer the sharp, cutting thing it was in those first months, but something more like a constant companion, always there, but no longer debilitating. Asterisk, asterisk, your sisters are thriving. Stella is as bossy as you ever were, always needing to supervise everything I do in the barn. Luna has your gentleness, your patience with visitors and children, and Ash, he's become a steady, reliable presence, protective of the girls, respectful but not submissive. You raised him well, Rosie. Whatever else you accomplished in your life, that alone would have been enough. Asterisk, asterisk. I've been thinking a lot about what you taught me. Not the obvious lessons about resilience and survival, though. Those were profound, but the subtler ones. You taught me that love doesn't require perfection. You loved me despite my failures, despite not finding you before the fire, despite all the ways I let you down. That grace, that unconditional acceptance, it changed how I think about all my relationships. Asterisk, asterisk. You taught me that presence matters more than grand gestures. The best times we had together weren't dramatic or special. They were the quiet evenings, standing side by side, the routine of daily care, the simple fact of showing up for each other day after day after day. Asterisk, asterisk. Most importantly, you taught me that some bonds really do transcend everything. Time, distance, death itself, they can't break what's real. You're gone, but what we shared isn't gone. It lives in me, in Ash, in Stella and Luna, in everyone who's heard your story and been moved by it. Asterisk, asterisk. The crescent-shaped scar behind your ear, the mark that let me find you again after 21 years, it's become a symbol for me now. A reminder that our wounds don't just harm us, they also identify us, mark us as survivors of specific struggles. That scar saved you by making you recognizable. Maybe all our scars work that way, helping us find our way back to what matters. Asterisk, asterisk, I'm getting old, Rosie. My body is wearing out in ways I can't ignore anymore. I probably don't have as many years left as I'd like, but I'm not afraid. You showed me that love continues, that bonds persist, that what matters most survives, even when the physical presence doesn't. Asterisk, asterisk. When my time comes, I hope I'll have a fraction of your courage. I hope I'll face it with the same dignity you showed at the end. And I hope, though I don't know what I believe about afterlife or continuation, that somehow, somewhere, you'll know that I kept my promises to you. I took care of Ash. I'm taking care of Stella and Luna. I told your story truthfully. I honored your life by living mine in a way that reflected what you taught me. Asterisk, asterisk. Thank you, Rosie, for trusting me, for coming back, for showing me what really matters, for being exactly who you were, which was more than enough. Asterisk, asterisk. I'll love you until I draw my last breath, and probably beyond that too. Asterisk, asterisk. Ray times. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box where he kept his most precious things. Martha's wedding ring, Emily's baby pictures, photographs from his father's time on the ranch. Then he walked out to the barn, where the 3 donkeys were settling in for the night. Stella nickered when she saw him, and Ray spent a few minutes with each of them, checking water, making sure they were comfortable. As he was leaving, Ash approached and did something he'd only done a handful of times, pressed his head against Ray's chest, exactly the way Rosie used to do. Ray stood perfectly still, his arms coming up automatically to embrace the donkey's neck, tears streaming down his face. "I miss her too," he whispered. "Every single day I miss her too." But, standing there in the quiet barn with Rosie's son offering comfort, Ray felt something else alongside the grief-gratitude for the second chance he'd been given, for the year they'd had together at the end, for Stella and Luna and the continuation of Rosie's bloodline, for Emily's commitment to carrying forward the work. For every person who'd been touched by Rosie's story and changed by it, life offered no guarantees, no perfect endings, no certainty that love would be rewarded or effort recognized. but it offered moments. This moment right now, with a donkey's head against his chest and the smell of hay in the air and the sound of wind in the cottonwoods, moments of connection that transcended the inevitable losses, moments that made the whole difficult, painful, beautiful journey worthwhile. Ray had loved Rosie with everything he had. He'd saved her once, lost her once, found her again, and lost her again. Through it all, the love had remained constant, the one thing that never changed, never weakened, never failed. That was enough. It had always been enough. And standing there in the barn on a cold winter night, 71 years old, with a damaged heart but a full soul, Ray understood that he'd been given exactly what he needed. Not what he'd wanted Rosie to survive the fire, wanted 30 unbroken years together, wanted her to live forever. But what he'd needed was the journey itself, with all its pain and loss and impossible reunions. That journey had shaped him, transformed him, taught him what mattered. "Thank you," Ray whispered one more time to Rosie, to the universe, to whatever force had brought them back together. Then he released Ash, closed up the barn, and walked toward the house where Martha waited, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought, knowing that